And we're back for another module on how to build a certification study or practice lab. We've talked about the pyramid a little bit, done a review of that. We've talked about our previous course. We've seen now I can't remember the name of it, the build out scripts with PowerShell.
The AutoLab scripts.
The AutoLab scripts, which we had a conversation about maybe doing an entire course on sometime soon. We'll have to see if we can get that put together. Now we're going to talk about actually beginning to build out your own environment. We've talked about Azure, virtual labs, how to build out other pieces, or how to kind of use and consume other pieces that already exist. Now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of building out your own environment. So take it away.
Okay. This is called Assembling the Building Blocks, and our agenda consists of three things. First of all, setting up the hypervisor. I don't want to presume that you've used Hyper-V before, so I want to show you how that works, how to actually obtain evaluation software, and planning for routing. So let's get right into it. Setting up the hypervisor. As we've talked about before, a hypervisor is a software layer in Windows Server and certain editions of Windows Client that allow you to run virtual machines or share out your hardware processor, RAM, network, and storage. Already mentioned that Pro and Enterprise for Windows 8.1 and Windows 10 include the feature. If you do happen to be running Windows Server on hardware, you could install it there. In fact, I'll show you that in the first demo. Other options would be something like VMware Workstation is a popular desktop hypervisor. That's cross-platform. I guess I didn't explicitly say that Hyper-V will run only on Windows. VMware Workstation's cross-platform, but it costs. It's a retail product. Parallels Desktop is another desktop hypervisor. This one runs only on Mac OS, but it's also a retail product. Oracle VirtualBox is cross-platform free open source software, and for Linux, the main hypervisor there, certainly not the only one, is KVM. Now let's turn our attention to obtaining evaluation software. The TechNet Evaluation Center is where we want to go for this software. Specifically, what software you're looking for depends on your lab environment. You may decide that you want to set up an Active Directory forest, which is going to require some form of Windows Server. You may or may not want to integrate other servers, maybe Linux, maybe Windows desktop machines. I've already mentioned this a couple times. You need to have a free Microsoft account in order to do this, but other than that, there's no charge. If you have a subscription benefit like MSDN, that'll get you the software. If you have a subscription to Office 365, in particular the Enterprise Stock Keeping Units or SKUs, qualify you for downloading, for instance, the Microsoft Office suite to your desktop. There are a number of Microsoft programs that give evaluation software credit and Azure credit. BizSpark for business startups, DreamSpark for students. You could check those out. Just run a simple Bing search for either one of those terms. And you also can get credit, software and Azure subscription credit, if you hold certain Microsoft credentials, like if you're a Microsoft Certified Trainer, MCT, or a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, or MVP. Okay, well, let's get into a demo here, and we're going to do two things. The way they're listed on this slide is a little bit backwards. I want to show you the Evaluation Center first, and then we'll do client-side Hyper-V, both graphically and also with, drum roll please, PowerShell. Okay, here we are at the TechNet Evaluation Center. You'll recall that we were here earlier in the course when we looked at the virtual labs. But if we go to the Evaluate Now tab, this allows you to run a search or simply browse out to different Windows operating system software as well as server software. And when I say server software, I think SQL Server Database, Exchange messaging, SharePoint collaboration, etc. Windows Server 2016 is certainly a very appropriate choice for most Microsoft certifications. And you'll notice here it says it's a 180-day evaluation. Now that's a full-featured piece of software. In other words, it's not going to be feature restricted anyway. It'll just simply stop working after 180 days, in which case you could simply download another instance of it after that point. The download in this case requires that we fill out a brief registration to continue. The other elements underneath the entry include a description, a pretty detailed description actually, of what it is that you're preparing to download. In this case, it looks like that Windows Server 2016 comes as an ISO, which is a digital representation of a DVD or optical disc. Looks like we could also download an executable of the Nano Server installation option. There's some pre-installation instructions. Whoa, scrolled a little fast there. And then we have Explore, Try, and Learn. Explore is kind of cool because it gives you links to other resources, like, for instance, a white paper, The Ultimate Guide to Windows Server, the Windows Server website proper, Windows Server on Channel 9, Windows Server on YouTube. Under the Try heading, let's scroll.
Actually, I'm gonna do another little shameless plug. Go back to the videos.
Okay.
Under that Explore.
Yeah.
Look at that. Well, we should be on there. No, I guess not. Oh, go to Learn down at the bottom instead of Explore.
Right. Learn.
Oh.
There we are. Watch free Microsoft Virtual Academy sessions on Windows Server.
We just got that done last week, which is why I'm excited about it. So.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying here is don't just go directly to the download link. I know that you want to download the ISO, and that's perfectly reasonable, but I just wanted to call out these other elements: Explore, Try, and Learn. In fact, under the Try heading, you can see a link to Windows Server Virtual Labs on TechNet, you see? So there's actually quite a bit of value here besides the single link. Now, of course, you're going to need some time to download these ISO files. The Windows Server 2016 one may be as large as 5 gigabytes.
So on something else I can chime in here with, and I was sitting here trying to find it. I know it used to be done. I think we've moved this all to Azure now. One thing that Microsoft did for a period of time was allowed you to download, instead of the ISO or the install bits, an actual VM that was already pre-configured and built. Well, now what you can do, and I know this adds a layer that you haven't talked about yet, but if you go to Azure and sign up for a trial, you can deploy already built out virtual machines with an operating system. There's just a Windows Server 2016 VM. You deploy it, takes 2 minutes, and you've got a fully functional Windows Server to play with.
And to that point, in the Azure Marketplace, there's pre-built images for SharePoint, SQL Server, so you could seriously cut down on deployment time by using those images in Azure. Although, to play the opposite for a second, there's the learning challenge in deploying from bare metal.
And I agree, and I would say that, especially if you're learning, if this is something new, if you're building this lab for the sake of passing a certification exam, bare metal's the way to go. I mean, even if you're using a hypervisor on premises, download the bits, do the install from the ground up. Yeah, it's definitely a better, it's the way I like to do it even now. Even if I could get a VM pre-built, and even in the environment I have, I could build kind of a stock VM that I could repurpose for other servers I build. I still don't, because I just like having that hands-on every time.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, now in 21st century IT with DevOps and continuous integration, there's this push to automate everything. If there's something you're going to do more than twice, automate it. And as useful and valid as that is, and I think it is, from a learning perspective, it really is crucial that you understand in depth what the purpose of each step is that eventually you're going to automate. That's the world according to Tim, by the way. Let me minimize my browser, and why don't I show you about Hyper-V, client-side Hyper-V. The desktop you're looking at now is a Windows 10. I'm quite sure it's Enterprise Edition, but we can check that. What I like to do is, although Windows 10 gives us an honest-to-goodness start menu, and that's great, I'm glad to have that back, we can right-click the Start button to get this nice flyout. And I use this all the time. In particular, it opens up key MMC or Microsoft Management Consoles or control panel items like System. So if we go to System, this is going to show us what version we're using. Actually, I misspoke. I'm running Windows 10 Professional or Pro. What's good is that with Anytime Upgrade, you can change your stock keeping unit. So if you have a non-Pro, non-Enterprise version, you may be able to, without reinstalling the operating system, go to a Pro or Enterprise SKU, right?
Yeah, you just change your product key, and it'll make all the changes in the background.
Good. Now, as far as getting to that client Hyper-V piece, how do you do that? Well, we want to open up the optional features dialog. So again, I'm going to right-click the Start button and go to Programs and Features. This is just one of the control panel items. And we don't actually want the installed software here. Instead, we want to go to the sidebar and select Turn Windows Features On or Off. That's a user account control admin thing. You have to be an administrator on the system to run this. Let me stretch out this Windows feature dialog. And these are all optional components built into Windows itself. And if we look down to the H's, you can see I've already installed Hyper-V, which consists of, let's expand these subcomponents here, the management tools, which is the Hyper-V GUI tool, and the Hyper-V module for PowerShell. I'd strongly suggest you install both of those. And for the Hyper-V platform, there's the hypervisor, which is that software layer, and then additional services and features of Hyper-V. Bottom line, check everything.
Yeah, just check the top level box and call it good.
That's exactly right. On Windows Server, I'm actually going to open up a Hyper-V VM that I have running on this host. It's a little different. I just show you this, I guess, for educational benefit. In Windows Server, we can, for instance, from an elevated PowerShell console, run the commandlet get Windows feature. Now, this does not work on client Windows. It's server only. And if I look for Hyper-V, we see that the Hyper-V server role is available here on this machine, but notice the little box is not X'd, so it's not actually installed. We can call install Windows feature. I'm using tab complete here, one of the nice things about Windows PowerShell. I think it'll even complete feature names. No, I guess it wouldn't. When you're installing a Windows feature, a Windows Server feature from PowerShell, there's a couple switches that you may want to add. If you know in advance that you want all the sub-features, there's a switch parameter called include all sub-features, and a lot of newcomers to PowerShell will forget to add include management tools and then look around for the Hyper-V Manager application and not see it. So that's what we can do in Windows Server to install Hyper-V. Windows Server, you'll recall, Windows Server 2012 R2, Windows Server 2016 does have the graphical server manager application. We can install the Hyper-V feature there just as easily. It just depends on what approach you want to use. Here it is now. I won't go through the full click path, but I'll at least get you started here. In Server Manager, we can open up Manage, Add Roles and Features. It's still initializing here, so I may have to pause for a moment. I think it should go in now. Yep, we'll go past the welcome screen. We're going to do a role or feature-based installation on the local server. And there it is right here, Hyper-V. And as soon as you click that, it gives you an enumerated list of those sub-features that we didn't see in the PowerShell window. It's basically the management tools. Okay? So that's going to at least lay down the hypervisor. You know where to go to get evaluation software and start to download a library of ISO files. I'm going to open the Run box on my machine and browse to a folder on my C drive called Lab. And I've already got my lab off and running here, but you'll notice if I stretch the window and then I'm in Details view, do an invert sort by size, the virtual hard disk files are pretty darn big, 13, 15 gigabyte. And then here's a Windows Server 2016 ISO image that I downloaded, in this case from MSDN, but it's the same as doing it from the eval center. Looks like it's almost 6 gigs. So another point that we should mention explicitly is that you should have a fairly decent internet connection, at least while you're downloading these ISOs, because they can get pretty darn large. And also your host computer should have a fair amount of disk space. Now, what's a fair amount of disk space? Well, if we average, if our virtual lab is going to have maybe 3 or 4 VMs, and each one is looking at 13 to 15 gigabytes apiece, then we're talking about upwards to 50 gigs just for your virtual lab. So if you're constrained for hard disk space on your laptop or your desktop computer, it may necessitate an investment of, say, a USB external drive. Nowadays, the price on those has come down so much where it used to be inconceivable almost to have terabyte drives just USB'd into your computer. Now it's pretty darned affordable to do that. Let's come back to our slides now. And we'll plan for routing. Now, the routing piece isn't strictly speaking required here. The reason why I'm putting it in the lab as a requirement is because it extends what you can do with the lab so much more than otherwise. And to the point that we made earlier in this training about you want your lab to be as production-like as possible. Let's face it, it's going to be synthetic. It's not going to probably have the ups and downs and whoops and gotchas that you'll see in a production environment. Some things you just have to be hammering on day in and day out to see weird things happen. But we want to make it as realistic as possible. So this slide shows a screenshot from the Vios Virtual Router console. Their project page is vios.io. And this is a virtual router. It's a software-based router that uses the GNU Linux distribution. So it's free and open source. There's an interesting story behind Vios. It used to be called, actually it still is, Vyatta, V-Y-A-T-T-A. Very popular and powerful open source virtual router. But a company called Brocade Communications, who owned the project, took it into closed source proprietary land, and it still exists. You may want to check it out because the Vyatta router has some features that Vios doesn't. There's a GUI tool that you can use, and there's a couple other value adds that Vios does not have. But a group of community members, when Brocade took the code closed source, took the last release of the open source version, forked it into a new project, and they've been tending to it ever since. Okay, so that's just a little backstory on what this is. You can do so much more than simple IP routing with this router. You can do VLANs, or virtual local area networks. You not only can do static routing, but you can do dynamic routing, RIP, OSPF. It goes up to BGP, I mean, internet class routing protocols. We can do firewalling, virtual private network endpoints, VPNs. It's pretty powerful. It's far beyond the scope of what we're talking about in this training, but just know that I like to describe Vios as a tool that you can grow with over time with your skills. And for that matter, you may find that router configuration is interesting enough to where you may want to pursue certification in, say, Juniper or Cisco and get into network administration in addition to what you're doing with the Microsoft stack. So in this second demo, let's just investigate Vios a little bit, and then we'll close out this module. Here we are at the Vios website. It's Vios, vyos.io. The site makes me wonder if the developers are also authors or trainers because it's written in a super accessible way. But anyway, you see down in the lower right this GitHub link. The source code is completely transparent. You can inspect it. You can fork the project to your GitHub account. You can contribute to the project if you want to. When you actually go to downloads and download the ISO, they have a stable version, which is what I'd recommend you install, and a beta version. There's even a cloud version. That is, you can deploy a Vios VM in AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, or whatever service you're using. I've already downloaded it. I'll show you just for reference what the file size is, just for grins, because it's very small. You can run it as a live DVD, or you could install it on disk. Here it is right here. Version 1.1.7 is current as of this recording in early 2017, and it's 240 megabytes. Small footprint. I already have Hyper-V loaded on this Windows 10 machine and already have a lab set up. We'll get into the click-through of creating VMs in the next module. So I'm just going to show you that I have the router running here. It's actually operating. Let me right-click and connect in Hyper-V Manager. And the text is probably too small for you to see. So let me make use of the wonderful sysinternals tool, Zoom it, to bring our screen in a little bit more. If I can do this. I don't want to capture the mouse, so let's just click OK. And hope for the best. I've installed Vios on this virtual machine, so it's persistent. I'll give you the instructions for that again in the next module. The default login is user account Vios and password of Vios. you've ever worked with a router operating system, in particular the Cisco Internetwork Operating System or Cisco IOS, I believe that the VIOS OS was designed to be as accessible to, say, a Cisco administrator as possible. That's just what I find. If you type help, it gives you a very Unix, Linuxy dump of possible commands, and you can get context-specific help for each one of those commands, as you would expect. There's a number of show commands. For instance, I typed show con tab, and just like you see in the Cisco IOS, you're given an assortment of commands that match that string. So it looks like I can complete with configuration if I want to show the router's configuration, which I do. And it gives us a run of the different interfaces on the virtual router. And you'll notice I have two, one called Ethernet or ETH0 that has the IP address 172.16.10.1, and I have interface ETH1 that is mapped to the IPv4 address 172.16.21. So I have a .10 and .20 virtual networks in this situation. Let me release the mouse. That's something that you definitely want to make a note of in Hyper-V, by the way. What is the release key for the mouse? And if you're wondering, Tim, what are you talking about? In Hyper-V Manager, under File Options, whoops, no, that's not what I wanted. In Hyper-V Manager, let me try this again, pause. In Hyper-V Manager, we can right-click the server and come down to Hyper-V Settings, and there's an important option in here for releasing the keyboard, for releasing control of the virtual machine. It's under User Mouse Release Key, and you can change that here. I chose Control-Alt-Shift because I'm predominantly a lefty and it's easy for me to get those keys. But that can be useful when you're running a Linux or Unix-based VM, because when it's running and when you're connected and click inside the window, I'm going to get rid of this warning. It can be tough to come out of the VM sometimes because the VM will capture the mouse. So it looks like for some reason I'm not doing that now with this router window, but anyway, I wanted to make sure to just quickly show you that. Again, that's right-clicking the server and going to Hyper-V Settings to adjust settings for the application. What have we learned as we bring this module to a close? Well, one, we'll observe that our net cost for building the lab has been 0 thus far. And this is an important caveat, I think, that simply building this test lab, working through these steps bit by bit, does presume, I would say, at least intermediate level networking and operation skills. Because you might think, well, yeah, okay, I agree with Tim. Having a router would be really awesome for my certification practice lab. But meanwhile, I have a fundamental question. What is a router? You know, and that's not something that you can necessarily presume. So there is a thought, I would say, I'll tender this for your consideration, that prior to embarking on your Microsoft certification journey, you may want to remediate and buff up your skills with basic networking and basic computer hardware and software. It speaks to what Christopher and I were talking about last module, I think, that it can be easy working in the cloud especially to forget about hardware, CPU, RAM modules, the motherboard, internal hard disks. There's a vendor-neutral certification called the CompTIA Network Plus that a lot of IT newcomers will go for because it will give you an opportunity to understand what a router is, what a switch is, the purpose of IP addresses, because you really do have to have that foundation level skill to understand what we're doing today. The CompTIA A+ deals with computer hardware and software support basics. Anything to add there, Christopher?
The Microsoft Technology Associates.
Exactly.
We've got networking fundamentals, server administration fundamentals, mobility, cloud, SQL. There are a number of fundamentals. I'm trying to remember all of them at one time. I don't know the developer titles because I'm an IT pro on the IT pro side. So in line with the CompTIA certs, they're the kind of our equivalent. That's all I would add to that.
And that very well stated.
We may or may not have MBA courses on some of those.
And I think that someone I know taught some of the
It turns out.
MTA.
It turns out.
Very good. Well, thanks a lot for your participation. And in the next module, we're going to do creating the network. So speaking of switches, speaking of IP addresses, we're going to deep dive into that next. We'll see you then.